Today, we'll discuss how the federal government has failed to support Native American students and how conditions for these students has been exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ever since the United States took over millions of acres of land from Native American tribes, the federal government has had a obligation to provide Native American children with elementary, secondary education in the same way it does for children in states. Unfortunately, the federal government, particularly the Bureau of Indian Education, or BIE, has continuously failed to uphold this obligation. We know that Native American students before the pandemic experienced the lowest educational achievement rate of any racial or ethnic group. Four-year graduation rates at BIE schools are just 53% compared to the national average of 82%. In addition, the federal government watchdogs have found that BIE schools need to improve education for students with disabilities, repair crumbling facilities, and other improvements to meet health and safety standards. We also know that 1 in 3 Indian country residents lack broadband access. These disparities have only been exacerbated by BIE's slow and insufficient response to the pandemic. While schools in 33 states and the District of Columbia were closed by March 17th, BIE didn't officially close until a week later. Furthermore, some schools were reportedly still fully staffed up until the end of the month, needlessly exposing school workers to the virus. BIE also failed to transition schools to remote learning, further exacerbating the chronic lack of access to adequate digital instruction throughout Indian country. In fact, the National Indian Education Association survey found that only 30% of BIE schools were conducting remote learning by the end of March. Those schools also struggled to provide food assistance to students during school closures. Roughly 55% of Native American students at public schools had access to school meals. That's 55% of students at public schools had access to school meals compared to only 36% at BIE schools. To help address these disparities, Congress provided more than $200 million for BIE through the Bipartisan CARES Act, including $153 million through the Education Stabilization Fund. However, these funds were significantly delayed in reaching the schools. In fact, BIE relief funding was not fully distributed until 97 days after the CARES Act was signed, well after the 2019-20 school year had already ended. The BIE has also cited bureaucratic hurdles, such as incomplete paperwork for the delay in funding, but bureaucracy alone cannot explain the educational disparities that are only further disadvantaged Native American students during this pandemic. No matter which way you look at it, the federal government's failure to support Native American children is a failure to honor our century-old promise to provide the health, the safety, and education for tribal nations in return for the land so many Americans now call home. Today, we're joined by by Derek Frederick and Kevin Alice, who help us understand the BIE's failed response to the pandemic and to discuss the urgent need for the federal government to honor its legal obligation to support Native American students. Mr. Franklin currently serves as second vice president on the board of directors of the National Indian Education Association. He also leads the Office of Accountability and Compliance at the Navajo Nation Department of Dene Education, where he works directly with the tribally controlled schools, BIE-operated schools, and the state public schools to ensure that schools, school districts, and SEA's compliance with federal, state, and tribal laws. Mr. Alice is the current Chief Executive Officer of the National Congress of American Indians, or NCAI. He is an enrolled member of the Forest County Potawatomi community, and his previous roles include Executive Director of the Native American Contractors Association, the board chairman of the board of the Potawatomi Business Development Corporation, and founder and President of the Thunderbird Strategies LLC. Thank you both for your attendance today, and we'll have you make comments and then turn to members for questions, starting with Mr. Franklin. And you want to unmute, and there you go.
Thank you, sir. Chairwoman Lowy, Ranking Member Granger, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony on behalf of the National Indian Education Association. Yad Eshe Ya Derek Franklin Yanshia, Yo Twot Betho Zo Ade Nasha, Denebekeya E Adashiaho Do Adashagan. I see a head the Schneedo Lake Nantani, Washington, Dana Dano Kliniki. I currently work for the Navajo Nation Department of Diné Education, Office of Diné Accountability and Compliance. NIA is the most inclusive national organization advocating on the front lines of Native education. Our work centers on advancing cultural-based educational opportunities for American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and Native Hawaiians. Each day, our organization equips tribal leaders, educators, and advocates to prepare the over 650,000 Native students across the nation for success in our classrooms and beyond. Native education is a bipartisan effort rooted in the federal trust responsibility to our tribal nations and our citizens. Each of you on this committee has a critical role in upholding that responsibility, particularly during the public health emergency like our communities and the nation as a whole are facing today. For centuries, Native students, schools, and communities have long been underfunded and under-resourced. Compounded inequities came clearly into focus as our schools and tribal nations made difficult decisions to protect the lives and well-being of our students. With all that, with limited guidance, funding, resources, and infrastructure necessary provide continuing educational services in Native communities. In my own reservation, the Navajo Nation was particularly hit hard by the delayed response and clear guidance from the Bureau of Indian Education. This resulted in the first known spread of COVID-19 within our reservation boundaries, which occurred in a BIE-funded school. Due to conflicting directives from tribal, regional, and national officials, certain BIE-operated schools had retained essential staff, prompting a single case among staff to quickly spread throughout the surrounding community. At that time, BIE published a two-page memo that directed schools to follow CDC guidelines and to shut down if necessary. However, the BIE failed to produce a system-wide guidance to outline school sanitization and closure procedures or delayed policies for maintenance and educational services. As a result, many tribes partnered with states or developed their own systems to address needs for their students. Even in my own community, guidance communication varied widely. For example, BIE schools located on the Arizona side of the reservation received different guidance at different times than those located in New Mexico and Utah. In March and April, many BIE-funded schools prioritized the well-being of their students by closing school facilities. However, a history of underfunding Native schools meant that our students often had limited access to education services once the classrooms closed. Due to outdated technology infrastructure and lack of internet access at home, BIE schools have struggled to implement virtual education options during the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the NIEA survey conducted in April, only 44.7% of Bureau-funded schools reported that they are using digital learning tools during the pandemic, compared to 84.9% of public schools that serve Native students. Even schools with computer-equipped on-site often would not provide digital learning due to limited community broadband access at home. Just last year, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis reported that only 61% of households on reservations have broadband access, in comparison to 70% of residents in a typical county that overlaps a reservation have access to broadband at home. Communication issues have continued to complicate distribution of funding for the CARES Act, which was authorized by Congress on March 27, 2020. Despite the allocations of emergency education funding for BIE-funded schools, our schools did not report receipt of the funding until 3 months after congressional approval. As the committee considers critical resources and funding necessary to reopen our schools equitably this fall, NIEA urges Congress to consider the full scope of need for education programs. Congress must invest in programs and services critical to our schools to function. Increased cleaning and sanitization, greater demand for outdated transportation and facilities, lack of internet technology and infrastructure, and the need to plan for the possible spread in schools. Our tribes and schools make decisions to reopen this fall. Our schools must have the access to the resources and funding necessary that our students have access to safe and healthy classrooms. Thank you for allowing me to speak, and I will now address your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll hear from Mr. Alice first, and then we'll get to questions. Mr. Alice.
Great. So good afternoon, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Fox and members of the committee. On behalf of the National Congress of American Indians, we really do thank you for holding this important briefing. This is a very difficult time and a very difficult topic to talk about. And I could say ditto to everything that Mr. Franklin spoke to. Some of it I'll cover. Again, my name's Kevin Alice. I'm the proud son of an American Indian woman that was born and raised on our reservation in northern Wisconsin, and we're both citizens of the Forest County Potawatomi community in northern Wisconsin. And I'm very honored to serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the National Congress of American Indians, an organization founded 76 years ago, and we're the oldest and largest representative organization serving all the interests, broad interests of tribal nations and communities. Today, I'm honored to be invited to discuss the disparities in K-12 education for the American Indian and Alaska Native students in this country. Indian country is facing barriers in ensuring that our students have equal access to education across the country due to chronic underfunding of BIA, inadequate facilities, limited access to the broadband, as you heard, difficulty recruiting and retaining teachers, and a lack of culturally appropriate educational opportunities. I say to many people, if you could see some of these facilities, they're places you'd never want to send your kids. And why it's okay for Indian country and is really the question here. And thank you for this. Today, I look forward to the conversation on these issues, and will focus my remarks on pre-pandemic conditions, issues during the pandemic, and the present funding needs of American Indian education. First, let me address some of the pre-pandemic conditions. The pandemic has disproportionately impacted American Indian students due to underlying education and living disparities that are a result of chronic underfunding of the federal government's trust and treaty responsibilities. It's exposed all of this for all of us to see. There are approximately 620,000 American Indian students enrolled in public schools, both in the urban and rural areas, while 48,000 attend BIE schools. There are 183 BIE funded schools located on 63 reservations across 23 different states. The most recent data that we have shows that high school graduation rates for BIE students is less than 60% compared to the national average of 85% for the rest of the country. Prior to the pandemic, the federal government recognized that American Indian students were being educated in inadequate facilities. For example, the Department of Interior identified $629 million in deferred maintenance for BIE funded educational facilities and $86 million in deferred maintenance for BIE educational quarters, including severely overcrowded classrooms. In addition to the crumbling physical infrastructure, tribal communities lack infrastructure to engage in remote education. According to the GAO report not too long ago, only 65% of individuals living on tribal lands have access to fixed broadband, in contrast to the access rate of 92% of all Americans. Mr. Franklin spoke to that, and it's a serious problem when we're looking at the situation this country faces today in trying to reopen and get back to normalcy. Furthermore, 34% of Native students nationwide do not have internet access at home in their houses, compared to 24% of students nationwide. In addition to these infrastructure disparities that result in a less than ideal learning condition, the BIE has historically had difficulties when recruiting and retaining highly effective teachers. In short, who would want to go work into these in these poor environments that are poorly funded and are in bad shape? Employee health benefits and low salary make it difficult for quality teachers to consider careers in the BIE system. Let me address some of the funding during the pandemic. Initially, tribal and educational leaders were hopeful after the CARES Act was enacted because $153.75 million was allocated under Education Stabilization Fund to programs operated or funded by the BIE. In addition, we saw another $69 million appropriated directly to BIE to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. On March 31st, 2020, NCAI sent its first intertribal organization letter alongside of the National Indian Education Association to both the Departments of Education and Interior, requesting that these funds allocated under the CARES Act be dispersed quickly and with maximum flexibility to BIE-funded schools. But despite this request, it was not until April 28th and 30th that education held formal tribal listening sessions regarding the disbursement of the $153 million in funding. Finally, on June 9th, the BIE began distributing their directly appropriated $69 million to BIE schools, and on July 2nd, the agency began distributing the $153.75 million. This 97-day delay in releasing funds impaired access to distant learning, hindered schools from preparing for summer programming, and delayed assessment of technology needs. Lastly, I'll address emergency funding needs for our students. As BIE-funded schools begin to plan for the 2020-21 academic year, it's clear that our K-12 schools do not have the resources and educational infrastructure to ensure a safe return to our students. To address this, 21 national and regional tribal organizations have requested the following. 1, investment in emergency broadband access and deployment for BIE schools and tribal communities. 2, at least $1 billion in emergency funding to address the backlog of unfunded repairs and renovations to Bureau-funded schools, which are especially needed to address the overcrowded classroom situation that we see. And lastly, and third, at least $1.5 billion to BIE-funded schools to meet the health, safety, and educational needs of students due to the impacts of COVID-19. In conclusion, thank you so much to the committee for holding this briefing. I look forward to your questions and working with you to address these disparities.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of our witnesses for your testimony. You've laid out the concerns, and we're looking forward to doing something about it. We have 4 people that have indicated an interest in asking questions. Mr. Levin, Ms. Bonamici, Secretary Shalala, and Mr. Takano. Mr. Levin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for sharing your time and expertise with us. The $2 trillion CARES Act set aside only $10 billion for tribes, including $153 million for the Bureau of Indian Education schools. The state of Michigan has 12 federally recognized tribes who were fortunate to receive funding from the CARES Act, but it isn't enough to keep tribal communities safe and ensure Native American students have the critical education resources and support that they need. In an interview on March 28th with Michigan Radio, Aaron Payment, the first vice president of the National Congress of American Indians and tribal chairperson of our own Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians in the Upper Peninsula, pointed out that while Native Americans make up about 2% of the US population, the money for tribes in the CARES Act accounts for 0.5% of the bill's total appropriations, citing also that the federal government has a duty to fulfill its treaty responsibilities. Chairperson Payment continued by saying, and I'm going to quote him here, "Most treaties, when we negotiated our land, promised for the health, education, and social welfare of tribal citizens as long as the grass grows, the winds blow, and the rivers flow. So we have a direct right. It's not an entitlement. It's not welfare." End quote. Mr. Chairman, as far as I'm concerned, the grass is still growing, the wind's still blowing, and the rivers are still flowing. And that was true before the pandemic, and it's really also true today. So why does the federal government continue to fail our tribal communities in the way that these two gentlemen have expressed so eloquently and with a lot of statistical detail during the most unprecedented public health crisis in our lifetimes? Not only is it unacceptable, it's illegal, according to the very treaties that Chairperson Payment cites in the quote above. Our Native brothers and sisters have faced the severe consequences of inhumane colonialism for centuries in this country, including the massacre of millions of Native Americans by our government. And now we sit on the sidelines as COVID ravages through our tribal communities and exacerbates inequities for Native American students. We simply must do better. Mr. Franklin, recent reporting indicates that if the Navajo Nation were a state, it would have the highest COVID death rate in the United States. That is very upsetting. Would you describe the severity of the impact of COVID-19 on the Navajo Nation and on Native American communities more generally, if you wish? And yeah, don't forget to unmute, sir.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I can address that question. The severity is that this virus is attacking our elderly. Now, our elderly are the heart of our language. They are heart of our culture. They are heart of our stories. This question is very personal to me because I lost an aunt and uncle to the virus, and it creates the severity that our children are not going to learn from their grandparents. It's really hitting our grandparents really hard. So we have to take measures to ensure that if our children are going to school, that they're safe, that they do not transfer the virus to our elderly. And most of our families, they live with most of our elderly live with their kids and their grandkids. So we have to really take this seriously. The severity is again our 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 grandparents. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm very sorry for your loss in your own family. And I appreciate you sharing with us at that personal level too. But let's talk about that because I'm telling you that this committee, under the leadership of Chairman Scott, is, if I may say, almost obsessed with the idea that we have to not just shout at schools to reopen, but give them the guidance and the resources to reopen safely, using the best public health information we can. So let me ask Minister Alice to comment on that. What can the federal government do to meet the needs of Native American students during the pandemic? And if that's my end of time, Mr. Chairman, maybe, I don't know if we can answer or whatever you want.
Ms. Alice, if you could go very quickly, and as other questions come out, you may be able to expound.
So this is a first step, Congressman, and thank you for your great words. Okay, recognizing that there's a problem here and a shortfall, and recognizing all the things that go into it, the failure to look at us, the failure to understand that we're out there and that there is a trust and treaty obligation, that, to your point, this is not a welfare program. This should be on the non-discretionary side of the ledger of the federal government. We shouldn't be talking about this. This is in the contractual obligation that this country has, the Indian country. We need to invest in the infrastructure of American Indian education. That goes into the schools. I talked about the backlog of work, the hundreds of millions of dollars in funding that needs to go into the schools. They're literally falling down in some places, broken windows. Classes are subject to the weather outside because of lack of air conditioning, and no broadband access and internet access. All of us have been on airplanes across the country, and when the internet's not working on the airplane for 2.5 hours, it's maddening. We're like out of our minds. It's like that 24/7 on our reservations across the country. We can't imagine a world like that. So looking at the emergency funding of $1 billion, 1.5 for direct funding to make it safe to go back to schools. To Mr. Franklin's point, our history, our heart is with our elders. And when our kids go to schools, and if it's not a safe environment with safe equipment and safe infrastructure, they're going to go home to their parents and grandparents, possibly infect them, and literally kill them. And that would be tragic. So we need to look at these resources and properly fund what we're asking for to make sure we're in a safe place.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, we have Bonamici, Shalala, Takano, and Sablan. Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for this meaningful discussion. I very much appreciate it. And to our panelists, thank you. Mr. Franklin, I'm so sorry, as my colleague said, for your personal loss. Mr. Alice, you mentioned, why are these schools good enough for Native children? If they aren't good enough for our children, they aren't good enough for Native children. It's completely unacceptable, the condition of the school. So I represent a district in Oregon, and we have in Oregon, Chemawa Indian School, which of course a boarding school. It's been there for 140 years. You said 140th year anniversary. And right now, we had, of course, challenges at Chemawa even before the pandemic. And this is another one of those instances where the coronavirus pandemic has only exacerbated the inequities. And a lot of it here is, of course, we have the administration's failure to uphold treaty obligations and also failure to lead on solving coronavirus. So right now, with regard to Chemawa, it's been really hard to get information. Our local tribes are frustrated. Yes, there are links on the website, but how can the community and the families, because of course, students come from all over the country, how can they have some sense of what is happening and when and how the school will open? And if you could just briefly address the unique challenges of a boarding school, and then I do have a couple of other questions. But if either Mr. Franklin or Mr. Alice wants to take that on, the unique challenges of a boarding school.
Sure. I can speak to the Navajo Nation in terms of the challenges of boarding schools. Is that most of our schools, most of our boarding schools, we call them standalone. They're on the outskirts of the Navajo Nation. And so when they attend these boarding schools, they attend the public schools, the Arizona public schools or the New Mexico public schools or Utah public schools. And at this point, because of the COVID-19 hotspots that are located at some of these areas where residential programs exist, it's very difficult for these students to return. Some of our residential programs are electing to keep their facility closed, but the question is, where are they going to go?
Right, exactly.
Which residential program are they going to attend? And if that area is considered a hotspot for COVID-19, and the next question is, if these residential programs can take these students, then are they equipped to handle 200 plus students? Are they equipped to handle? Some of them only have the capacity of holding maybe 80 to 100 students in their residential programs. At one point, our dormitories, they used to house about 1,000 students. Now, because of the new school construction, it really narrowed down these residential programs. So when this pandemic hit, there's no place for these kids to go because their normal capacity will already filled up, and these kids will have the kids that need to go to another alternative school. They're not going to have room.
Right. And just to follow up on that, Mr. Franklin, according to the Heckinger report, BIE released a 2-page guidance document on how to implement remote learning. But in comparison, like New Mexico, for example, had extensive guidance with 31 pages of guidance. So how did this failure of the BIE to provide adequate guidance affect the implementation of some sort of remote learning in BIE schools?
Okay, thank you for asking that question, because the Department of Education was really looking forward to collaboration with the BIE. When this hit, we have to provide guidance to our schools. We have to show them some sort of way to go in terms of providing a continuous learning plan. So we made contacts with the New Mexico Public Education Department, the Arizona Public Education Department, because we weren't hearing anything from the BIE. So we started that communication. Then we received that 2-page document, that memorandum that was issued by BIE that went directly to a tribally controlled school. It bypassed the tribal education department. We didn't even receive a copy until maybe a week later when one of the tribally controlled schools on the Navajo Nation provided it to me. Then we looked at it. And it was very disappointing to us because it didn't provide what we saw from New Mexico, what we saw from what Arizona provided. So we said, hey, let's write a letter to BIE. Let's ask them to collaborate. We have a full-page document, very detailed, with New Mexico. Let's work together. The results, the email that we got from BIE was, we kind of did our diligence. This 2-page document is what we're going to provide.
Not enough.
They didn't. I have that email.
Okay, I want to get a quick question in the remaining few seconds to Mr. Alice. You talked about the delay in getting the CARES Act funding, 97 days. How did that affect Native students, that delay?
Well, let me just say real quick, and this is part of the answer to that, and I'm glad you asked me that question. These schools weren't ready to come back to a pandemic situation before the pandemic. They were in such bad shape that the resources are in such disarray. They weren't properly funded. And so what are we going to do? We're going to fund them to bring them back to a situation that was already, inappropriate and insufficient, to meet the challenges. It has caused schools and systems to not have enough time to get all the things that they need in place to marginally prepare a safe environment for students to come into. I mean, look, they were tough places to go to school in the first place. Now they're even harder because of a pandemic and because of the late funding in trying their best they can to get the proper equipment and infrastructure to make people feel comfortable.
Well, please, I know the bell is annoying, but I just want to say, please know that we are on this committee and this briefing committed to doing what we can to solve this. It is completely inexcusable, and please know we're going to fight for you. Thank you. I yield back.
Secretary Shalala.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Department of the Interior is hardly an education department. And one of my struggles when I was Secretary of HHS was coordinating with the Interior Department, the Indian Health Service. It seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that we need to find a way to bring these services for the tribes together under appropriate committees, preferably ours, so that someone takes responsibility for the integrated services for our Native American brothers and sisters. The structure, both of the Congress as well as the federal government in relationship to keeping the promise of the treaties, it seems to me rules against that because it's so fragmented. And at least at the leadership of the Congress, of the House, it seems to me that's one of the things that we ought to look at because it is so fragmented. And I was wondering whether either of their guests would like to comment on that.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that comment, Secretary Shalala. And it's not in any of my prepared answers because you are exactly right. The fragmented delivery of the treaty and trust responsibility is maddening. You have education, you have HHS, you have DOJ, you have Interior, all of them managing different portfolios directed towards, supposedly assisting and moving Indian country along and helping them, grow and be prosperous and vibrant. And in many situations, none of those organizations, none of those efforts are even coordinating well with each other. We have the 477 program, for example, that is supposed to consolidate and allow tribes to, in a menu approach, put together in one package the delivery of different grant programs. They can't even get that right now and having a problem. Interior has no control over what education is doing, HHS, HUD, and we see this from our seats, and it's very upsetting and it's very damaging to the goals of Congress. When Congress, you guys have the vision to see what we need, and when you put it in legislation that gets passed, it gets all kind of fouled up on the administration side, and in which you see the need to be and responding to it isn't happening on the other end through this fragmented process. So I'm glad you highlighted it. It goes beyond this committee, but certainly something that has to be addressed long term on who's responsible for this.
I'd like to comment if I may.
Yes, please, Derek.
Thank you. It's within the BIE structure, through the interior, it's broken. They do not communicate with each other. The BIE and DPA, Division of Performance and Accountability, they just do not communicate. In fact, they probably fight with one another to try to implement things at the school. On top of that their system is too slow. If you compare them to an SEA, like New Mexico Public Education Department, and their system, it's very slow. They have to, in order to get a document approved, they have to go up so many layers of bureaucracy within their system, whereas New Mexico, it's quick. We were so impressed with how New Mexico and Arizona was implementing technical assistance to tribes, where BIE was very slow. It's because of their system. If the Interior is going to run schools, they have to come up with a better system and stop reinventing the wheel, reinventing their organizational chart as a system that's going to fix. So far, their organizational charts that they develop has not fixed the system, has not, in our eyes, on the Navajo Nation. Thank you.
Thank you. I spent a wonderful summer living with the Navajo people a long time ago, so I've got a special place in my heart. And I've been working with the tribes for a long time. We've got to figure out a way to fix this because it's the delivery system, but it's also the structure of Congress as well in terms of who's responsible. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chicano. And then after that, Sablon and Mr. Chicano.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, for holding this hearing. And Congressman Shalala, you raised, I think, our two guests have confirmed you've raised a very, I think, important point, which is the fragmented jurisdictions. And actually, the VA has a memorandum of understanding with the Indian Health Service. And actually, during this national pandemic, there were supposed to be separate agreements with all of the tribes as to the VA's role. And in fact, the VA has played, I think, a useful role in some of the tragedy we see unfolding in the Navajo country. The VA has attempted to make its resources available where it can. But Congressman Shalala, I want to also call your attention to an issue related to actually governance. I too, like Congresswoman Bonamici, have the Sherman. I have a residential school which draws Native American students from across many different tribes. And as I visited that school early in my tenure, part of my frustration was that the administrators were barred specifically by law to be able to go and appeal to the government for what they needed. And it, in a normal structure, in a regular private boarding school, you would have, a board of trustees or some sort of governance like that. And there was some sort of structure like this, but it was very diffuse. So it was hard to understand how I, as a member of Congress, could work with the very boarding school that was in my district because of how governance worked. I see Mr. Franklin, you're nodding your head. You want to kind of elaborate on what my frustration is because we actually have pretty decent facilities, but in terms of making sure that programs work, that there's any kind of partnerships they can form with the private sector, all of these things are cumbersome. In fact, one of the wealthy tribes in our areas, in my area, actually did give them a major grant. But accountability and governance is really something that's an issue.
Thank you. I'd be happy to address that. So it depends on what type of school within the Bureau is operating. So you have Public Law 100-297 schools, which they have total control over the school itself or residential program. Then you have Public Law 93-638, which is the Indian self-determination, and that's set up the same way. Then you have Public Law 95-561, which are what we call BIE operated. So within each of those statutes, the total, like for example, 100-297 schools, which we call grant schools, the governing board has the total autonomy to implement what's best for their children at their site. Now, with the issue with the BIE is that we're finding out that because the BIE issues 100% of funding to these Public Law 100-297 schools, they have the idea that we are no longer going to provide technical assistance to them. And I have several examples to talk about in that issue. On the Public Law 95-561 schools, the school boards, the governing boards that are at that school, they are kind of set in as advisory. The BIE still has control over implementing what they feel is right. They just advise the governing board at these BIE operated schools. But the issue that we have here on Navajo is that the BIE still has their fiduciary responsibility, whether which type of school you have. You must still provide technical assistance. That is why you have an organizational chart. That's why you have a manpower of 100 staff or more under the BIE. What are they doing? Are they just sitting there? I mean, I have tons of examples of how services are not provided to tribally controlled schools. I hope this answers your question, sir.
Well, Mr. Scott, I would ask assistance from your staff and just sort of reviewing the way that these residential schools, there's not that many of them, but I actually have a residential school that's been in existence for over 120, 130 years. It was closed because by the public health officer in my area in Riverside County. Okay. But normally we have a number of students from Navajo country, from Montana, all different tribes. Any student in the country, any Native American student can actually choose to come to the kind of school that we have. But as far as governance and accountability, all of that I think is got to be reviewed. I don't know what's happening to the staff and how the staff is able to assist the students that aren't able to attend this boarding school. What resources are available to those students who normally would have been enrolled in the school. They've all been sent home, I'm pretty sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Sablon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the two witnesses too. And this for some reason attached to me. It was a couple of years ago when we had a hearing and we had looked at the GAO report on the state of the infrastructure of Indian country schools. I mean, it was just dilapidated for many, including in some of the coldest part of our country. The heaters were not working. There were not enough student desks and chairs, and here we are now into this pandemic, for example, and schools are going to be based on. I guess we do have a national Board of Education for our Native American students, the Bureau of Indian Education. Here we are, we would need an expanded broadband, an effective broadband system, and I'm wondering if there are broadband systems in many of the Indian countries, if there is sufficient system for students to attend school hybrid, for example. Either of you can answer.
Let me speak for what exists on the Navajo Nation. Thank you for that question. The broadband services that exist on the Navajo Nation is very limited, and I'm assuming it's like that for other tribes as well, especially the ones in very rural areas. So if you think of the Navajo Nation, it's the size of the state of West Virginia. So in very rural areas, some of our schools do not have enough broadband to even in the pre-pandemic time frame, they can even operate any type of virtual type setting because of the broadband that exists within our schools. So now that it's pandemic and everybody went virtual, past 3 months, it's been very difficult. So a lot of our schools have just been administering packets, academic packets that are sent home to students. But because of the virus, how are we going to know if these packets are being graded, or how are we going to show that students are learning? Right. So even if we decided to go to virtual, it's not going to be very useful because of our schools that are located in very rural areas.
And my heart is schools, because the department here is in no position to. I mean, and I've said this cannot wear the Bureau of Education as a badge of honor, because they have not. They have their performance has not been even good. I mean, not even close to good. And we need to, Mr. Chairman, work harder and make sure that our Native American brothers and sisters get the and I do my time back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Hayes.
Hi, Mr. Chair, thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. My question is for Mr. Alice. Can you talk a little bit about how the statements by the President and the Secretary of Education threatening federal aid based on the reopening of schools undermine the United States federal trust responsibility to provide education services to tribes as sovereign nations?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. It's very concerning because when you look at where the funding for school goes, where all the money comes from, the president doesn't have any authority to have shut down schools in states and that are not funded directly from the federal government or that control. But when you look at BIE and it's one of the two federally run school systems, okay? They have direct control over that. And when you look and you review, some of the stuff that Mr. Franklin and I talked about the broken systems that are in the education system in Indian country, the lack of broadband, the late money coming in where tribes and the school systems couldn't get the right protective resources and make the environment safe. It's not ready. It's not time necessarily for us to get back to school, and it's a really scary situation. And so if we deem that it's not safe for our kids to go back to school, and we have any influence on that, and it doesn't happen, that we get penalized. What are we going to be, and we're going to be harmed by some unfair reopening policy that just isn't looking at all the factors out there that are needed to be looked at for safe environments for school. Listen, we want to get back to school, but we want to go back to school in environments that are comfortable, safe, and efficient and valuable for our students. And not having face-to-face interaction with the teacher loses so much. There's no question asking, going back and forth. And because we don't have broadband, like the rest of the country, these packets going back and forth in the mail, how do you educate that way? There's no personal interaction, no question asking. None of that stuff is good for our American Indian students.
Thank you. Mr. Franklin, do you have anything to add to that, or about the challenges for meeting the CDC guidelines in order to do it? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of difficulty in meeting the guidelines and doing what they're asked, and then the consequences of not opening on, funding and those tribal obligations. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, as Mr. Alice explained, the funds were delayed, and that caused a serious issue on the Navajo Nation. I work directly with schools. My communication is directly with them. So when they have issues of no guidance from the BIE to say, okay, this is we're activating mission critical motives, or we need PPEs. Can we use our existing funding without being penalized so that we have protective equipment for staff, for children, in order to move forward? Well, we're still waiting for the CARES Act. 3 months later, the CARES Act comes in, and then they have to deal with overpriced PPEs that vendors are now price gouging their PPEs for schools to purchase. And then some of them are on back order. Some of them, because of schools located in very rural areas, it's difficult for schools that are located near urban areas. So it's difficult for schools to purchase the necessary PPEs further without the beginning guidance of, mission critical, then purchase these stuff for your students. That's kind of what the states are doing. Why can't the federal government do the same thing? And that's kind of the concern that exists here on the nation is that. And the other thing is the computer usages. If a Navajo BIE funded school wanted to implement virtual learning, the computers that exist are only at the school. They're desktops. There's no iPads and so forth. So that is difficult and to purchase these, they have to wait. And then, when other schools in other states are purchasing these equipments, they have to compete. So what basically results in the back order of laptops, Chromebooks, iPads, and so forth. So they kind of have to wait even longer. Sorry.
No,
I'll stop.
thank you. No, actually, you've painted a very clear picture, and it sounds like where a state at local districts, the state is their first line of defense.
Yes.
The only support staff that you have in the tribal nations is the federal government. So we really have to be there to support school reopening and helping with the resources that you need. Before I close, I just want to say, Mr. Franklin, that your plants are lovely. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you.
Surfboard.
Mr. Alice, you indicated the number of students, total students, and the number that were at BIE schools. Could you repeat those statistics?
Yeah, it was 48,000 students in BIE schools, and the other number, bear with me. Sometimes I have these right on the tip of my tongue, and sometimes I need to refer. I do know the 48,000 in BIE schools, and the other number was, oh boy.
So there's 48,000 students in Bureau-funded schools.
Yeah,
across-
and then in the state schools, it was 620,000, Mr. Chairman, and yeah, that's it.
And those 620 are in public schools.
Correct.
They're not living on reservations.
They could be. They could be. They could be very well living on reservations. It's not just because it's a public school attendance doesn't mean that they're not on a reservation community.
So school districts overlap reservations.
Yes.
Who makes the choice as to what school they attend?
It depends on the parent. If they have hardship, then they send them to residential programs to attend schools. If they don't have the transportation or the necessary running water or electricity, some schools that attend public schools, sometimes buses have to travel an hour out and an hour back in, sometimes 2 hours out and 2 hours back in. So kids, like during wintertime, kids get on the bus at night and then they come home at night. Attending public schools.
Okay. Are the others wish to ask questions? Any follow-ups? If not, Mr. Franklin, Ms. Alice, I want to thank you for your testimony. It's been extremely helpful. And obviously we have a lot of work to do, and you've really motivated us to focus on the issue. We've got a lot of work to do, and I want to thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
If there's no other
committee, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This concludes the briefing.